warbirds, history, World War II flying, and more. This show is supported by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. This nonprofit membership organization has preserved and flown historic aircraft for more than 65 years. CAF's mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences, and you can support the CAF through donations, membership, and by volunteering your time and talents. You can visit commemorativeairforce.org for more information. I'm your host, Steve Buss, and welcome everyone watching tonight on Facebook, YouTube, and those of you watching on GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar. If you would, please take a second to like, share, subscribe, and follow us so we can keep you up to date on all the episodes of Warbird Tube. Now, on this episode, we're going to explore the history of the famed B-29 Superfortress, and more specifically, the CAF's B-29 Fifi, which is just about ready to hit the road on this year's AirPower History Tour. Now, during the presentation, if you have any questions for our guests, just put them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get them answered before we close the broadcast tonight. And now, joining us from the CAF B-29, B-24 Squadron is Al Benzing and Konley Kelley. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Steve. Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you. Well, let's go ahead and get started with some of the history of the B-29.
All right. Well, I'm going to kick things off. And my name is Konley Kelley. I'm the education officer for the CAF B-29, B-24 Squadron. And with me is Al Benzing, our executive officer and a pilot on both our B-29 and B-24. And he'll be talking more specifically about flying Fifi. I'm going to cover more of the history. So I wanted to tell you as we launch into the presentation that we did this presentation for Fifi's 75th birthday back in July 31st, 2020, and it was much longer. We did about 90 minutes. So we recorded that presentation. It's on the Squadron's YouTube channel. So we had to take an axe to it a little bit for this one. So there'll be some information at the end if you want to see our YouTube channel and see the expanded director's cut. We'll have that ready for you. But I think we have a great presentation in line for you. So you can go to a black and white shot of a B-29 taken at some point. I'm not seeing the slides advance. I'm sorry, guys. Should I be?
Yeah, I'm not either.
Yeah. So let us know, Steve. I just see the Warbird tube slide right now, the first slide.
Right.
Because I'm looking at B-29 in 1940.
I could probably tell you about that while you're working.
Okay. All right. Please do.
I can wing it. That's our favorite thing to say. The B-29 was the largest bomber of World War II. It's been called beautiful, streamlined. There we go. Awe-inspiring. It's also been called the bomber that helped bring an end to World War II. Of course, during the firebombing missions of Japan, which we'll talk about, and the atom bomb missions. We've had folks tell us on tour and members of our squadron that are about the right age that if we had to invade Japan, they may have never been born. So this plane truly made a difference, and it can be said it brought an end to World War II in many ways. So the B-29 came about because in the late 1930s, U.S. Army Air Corps, specifically General Hap Arnold, wanted a very long-range bomber called a super bomber that could take strategic bombardment to potentially enemies way across the ocean, like Japan, which they envisioned might be an enemy and we might be at war with. So the bomber specifications were they wanted a bomber that could reach a speed of 400 miles per hour at a range of well over 5,000 miles, could carry, and they expanded this up to 20,000 pounds in bombs, which was twice that a B-24, B-17 could carry, and had a service ceiling up to 40,000. The 6 desirables for the plane were that it was pressurized. It was the world's first pressurized bomber, and it had heated crew stations. Had the largest piston engines of any bomber, 18 cylinders, twin row. It was made with about 271 pounds of sheet metal, and had 2 tandem bomb bays, which was where it could carry 20,000 bombs or fuel tanks or mines. You'll hear about that. At a gross weight of 70 tons and 141-foot wingspan, 90 feet long. At 141-foot wingspan, it was about 21 feet longer than the Wright brothers' first flight, so of 120 feet. So that's kind of an interesting factoid. Next. All right, the next slide will talk about the gun systems, which were the most sophisticated part of the plane. In fact, probably the best operating part of this very technically challenging aircraft. So we had 12 50 caliber machine guns, and the crews could stay in relative comfort because they were not exposed to the elements. They were early computer technology, they were remote controlled, and a very sophisticated fire system, and a collaboration between the side gunners, the central fire control officer, and the gunners in the front. Just the best operating system on the plane. You also had increased armor, of course, the Norden bomb sight, and self-sealing fuel tanks. What's amazing, if you think about it, this was the most expensive weapon in America's wartime arsenal. In fact, the design, development, and manufacturing of the B-29 was a full $1 billion more than the Manhattan Project that brought us the atomic bomb. So where were these planes built? They were built all over the country, but in 4 specific areas for the most part. You had Bell Aircraft building in Marietta, Georgia, Martin Aircraft in Omaha, Nebraska, and then Boeing building most of the 4,000 B-29s were built. They built about 766 B-29s out of 4,000 in both the Renton plant in Washington area and Wichita, Kansas. And the construction of these planes was a round-the-clock effort. Who built these aircraft? Well, thanks to Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor in the Roosevelt administration. A lot of the laborers on these aircraft that built the planes were Rosie the Riveters. It was her notion to bring women into the workforce in mass while the men were away at war. And this was true at Willow Wren, and of course it was true at the B-29 plants. And you can see some pictures of B-29s under construction. It's amazing to see that. But let's talk about one of the issues that plagued our B-29s, the engines. The Wright Cyclone R3350 engines for the B-29s were troublesome because they were prone to overheating. And this became apparent when the first test flights of the XB-29 started in September 1942. In February 1943, one of these test flights cost the life of famed test pilot Eddie Yellen and his crew. The engines overheated and they caught fire. Later, there were some improvements made, and you went from model 341, you saw earlier in our slide, to 345, and then all-out production of the B-29 commenced without much delay at all after the test flights and some of the accidents. We needed this bomb. So this resulted in an amazing feat of industrial manufacturing called the Battle of Kansas. At the time, Hap Arnold, over the 20th Air Force, he had a personal mission. He wanted 175 combat-ready B-29s by the spring of 1944. Well, this was promised, but wasn't going to happen. And the B-29s found quite a few of them were at the modification centers in Wichita, Kansas, being worked on. The engines were still having issues. They had defective pressure seals because it's pressurized aircraft, remote control turrets, sighting systems, electrical failures. So what they called beef ups became the norm, and you had technicians brought in from many other plants to meet General Arnold's goal, and he won the Battle of Kansas, even though these technicians were often working in below zero temperatures in winter that year. So Al's going to talk more specifically, now these 29s are off in combat, about what the flight crew characteristics look like.
Yeah, so the crew on this was generally 10, with the addition of a radar operator. It was 11. Not all of the 29s had radar or radar operators, but a good number did, including our Fifi at one time had an antenna for the radar. So we had an aircraft commander or pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, and radio operator. They were all in the cockpit of the aircraft. We had 6 up in the cockpit. The CFC officer, or central fire control, and a left and right gunner were in the gunner compartment behind the wing, where you see the top bubble and side bubbles. The tail gunner, of course, was in his little compartment far in the back. The radar operator, if he was on board, would be in the compartment just behind the gunners. So he had his equipment back there. And so when we take a quick look at what it was like in the wartime, we can see on the left side, you have the aircraft commander, and to his right, the co-pilot. Straight ahead in the front, sitting way up in the nose, is the bombardier. On the lower right, you can see the exterior shot of the bombardier's position. So you can see the instrument panels and so forth of the cockpit area. And the next slide, I believe, is the the bombardier inside and outside. So he had his Norden bomb sight, which, as you got near the target, was his primary focus. En route to the target, he was the gunner for the front. So he also had a gun sight that he could move over and have in front of him for taking care of fighters that were coming at them as they came in onto the landmass. The next, I believe, so we have the Navigator Station. He's got a work table, a window, and you can see above his work table on the right photograph a little dark cylinder. And that is the radar scope. It's a repeater from the radar operator in the back. The radar was used primarily for navigation. It would show outlines of the coastline, and of course, big things like Mount Fuji would show up. You didn't have any kind of detail where you could detect a target, even on the more advanced versions. But with the navigation challenges of the era, it was wonderful to have this radar as a tool. The additional crew members, flight engineer was in charge of this aircraft servicing and operation of the engines. So we see the panel here. He's got all the engine gauges and systems gauges. He's a very busy guy. Radio operator, it was kind of an interesting situation. He had a ton of radio gear, which was far less capable than anything we can hold in our hand these days. But the ironic part was, most of the time they were operating under radio silence, certainly inbound to the target. But they had the capability of talking on what they call a command set, where they could talk to others in the formation if it was appropriate to do so, or longer range, they could talk on HF, high frequency. So he was tucked in behind the gun turrets up there. Central fire control in the back. On the far left photograph, you can see him up there with his gun sight, and he's on his pistol grips. And on the far right's a picture of the chair he would sit in. And so he could rotate around and have a 360-degree view, and could either shoot gun turrets himself or direct those on his left or right to fire. There were default stations, who is getting which turret under what circumstance. So that was all well thought out. And there were secondary assignments as well. Each of these sites had a dead man switch. So if you weren't holding it or were not able to hold it, someone else would get your gun turret. The next shows the radar operator position. So he has a scope, and it's a guard around it because it's difficult to see. So he placed his face right up against that to get the best view possible. And he has instruments as well, airspeed and other navigation instruments that assist him. The tail gunner, here we have one riding on the top. I hope it wasn't too hot that day. What's interesting about this, on the right, you see this complex gun sight. This is the same gun sight that each of the bubbles and the bombardier had. And it was a engineering marvel, really. It would make corrections for speed, altitude, and other variables to allow them to get an accurate shot. Except on the lower left, you could see it had a big 20-millimeter cannon out the back, and the ballistics on that were considerably different than the 50 cals that are next to it. So that was a bit of a challenge as to whether that 20-millimeter cannon was actually going to hit anything. So a lot of times that was removed just to give more accurate fire and save some weight. Con?
All right. We're going to talk about the beginning of service, India and China. So combat-ready B-29s arrived in India in March of 1944 and went on to forward bases that were being constructed in China over the hump. We're going to talk about the hump. So here you see likely a B-29 that's gone over the hump several times with the markings there with the camels. And I don't think that's a forklift down in the corner. I think they had to use something else to load the planes. To build the bases in China was quite an undertaking. They had to enlist Chinese laborers. And these Chinese laborers had to literally just crush rocks on airfields to make the airfields, the B-29. There were lots of accidents, probably many supposedly might have been crushed to death or died in other ways. But I mean, this is the massive undertaking of this, which included at the time near Chengdu, 500,000 Chinese were mobilized to build 4 bases from 1943 to 1944. So we're indebted to the Chinese to get these bases built. We did not have another way to launch these planes against Japan. But let's talk about the hump specifically. The hump was an issue for these aircraft because we had to get fuel, parts, supplies over the hump to the bases in China where the planes would launch out towards Japan. Well, at the time, there were, you were in the eastern Himalayas, so the tallest mountains in the world, over 100 peaks, over 22,000 feet. The weather itself, there's no real good forecasting at the time. Some of the worst weather in the world was over this mountain range. And you even had a nickname of this stretch of the airplanes are flying over was called the Aluminum Trail. Kind of ironic to say that. I mean, that of course signifies because of all the crashes of the aircraft, and you can see the statistics there in the corner. Quite a dangerous task to get these aircraft and munitions over to the bases in China. B-29s were flying this, C-109s, DC-3s, C-46s, and I think our friend Dick Cole that we was talked about at the recent Warbird tube radio did some flying over the hump, if I recall. So let's talk about the first strike against Japan. Of the 49 missions planned over Japan from the bases in China, 9 were achieved. 125 B-29s were lost, and for the order the Marianas. The very first strike was, I think, indicative of what they were facing. And it was also a test of the B-25 strategic bombing capability. They launched 68 B-29s, only 49 were able to reach the target for various reasons, and 3 were lost on the mission, and then the mission was ineffective. 1 bomb hit the factory that they were aiming for. So quite disappointing. So the Marianas and the move of the Marianas, which we'll talk about in the next slide, was critical to making these B-29s do the job we meant them to do. So Marianas might be considered another turning point in the Pacific War, and a critical one, because we now were able to launch aircraft within range of Japan. On June 11th, 44, Saipan was invaded and taken. It's 1,500 miles from Tokyo, and 20,000 dug-in Japanese defended the island, and almost 24,000 were killed in the ensuing battle, and 3,500 U.S. soldiers were killed, another 13,000 wounded. And then we went on and had a battle in Guam, also the Marianas, on July 20th, and then finally in Tinian. So these are the 3 primary B-29 bases in the Marianas, all within range of Japan. Next slide. But you didn't have the Chinese laborers building these bases. You had our Seabees. The Seabees established in March of 42, the Can-Do Seabees. On June 15th, 44, the Seabees arrived on Saipan and built about 7,000 buildings, airfields for the B-29s. Of course, they were experts in construction and demolition, and then they were on Tinian by July 24th, 1944, while there was still combat going on. So let's look at the Tinian shot. The Tinian North Field. This is North Field on Tinian, which became at the time the largest airfield in the world. I was trying to read about the runways. I'm not sure. There were 7 or 8 8,000-foot runways, 265 B-29s on hard stands on the north airfield. In the back, you see the south airfield. Al's flown over this island and seen it, so you can see the undertaking to give us the base at Tinian, which eventually will be the base that the Enola Gay and Boxcar take off from with the atomic bombs. Let's talk about the remaining challenges they still had, even with taking the Marianas and taking the fight to Japan. So the great hope of the B-29 as a high-altitude bomber was dashed, and it was dashed because of some things that affected these aircraft, even though they were designed for high-altitude bombing. Japan was often covered by clouds. The weather was unpredictable. There were no real solid forecast. And then something unknown to us at the time, really, the jet stream. The jet stream affected the bombing patterns that were, because and the aircraft's ability to fly through them, to get on target. And then you had early radar in the planes. It was called the AN/APQ-13, which were meant to do the job to see through the clouds, but still the results were not satisfying, and you had a lot of missions that would take had to go many times more than they have to destroy targets, and the targets just were not being delivered the blow we wanted these B-29s to. So the next slide brings that home. This is what they had: an analysis of the B-29s bombing from altitude under these conditions, and it was determined that it could take as many as 400 B-29s to assure the destruction of just one industrial target. And that just was not satisfying, not adequate for the needs. So we had a change in command by bringing in General Curtis LeMay, and he completely threw the book out the window. Instead of high altitude missions, he designed a bombing strategy where the B-29s flew over their targets at night, low as 10,000 feet, and dropped incendiaries. And this strategy was based on the Japanese cities being very compacted, lots of wood, flammable, and the bombs could do a lot of damage, and they did. The first mission of this type, the first night mission, was called Operation Meeting House, and you can see the statistics at the bottom. It's almost horrifying. Here's where the B-29s are becoming truly weapons of mass destruction. You can see the statistics there: 100,000 people killed in one night by incendiaries, and you can see the results of the city of Tokyo, almost 25% of the city destroyed. So this became the norm. This became the strategy, and it was effective. And this is a map showing some of the major bombing missions. There were total of, I have this down here, 65 cities destroyed in these bombing missions, 602 factories, a lot of refineries, a lot of aircraft plants. Unfortunately, around 2,300,000 homes were destroyed, 330,000 civilians killed. In fact, more civilians were killed in the firebombing raids over Japan than the Japanese military in the first 3.5 years of the war. The next slide, we're going to talk about another strategy, maybe not as well known, the mining of the Japanese water routes. 1,250,000 tons of shipping were sunk by mines. And you can see the mines being dropped by the aircraft and some statistics here. So basically, we were starving Japan of food and supplies, and it was having a devastating effect on the population. So not only were we bombing them from the air, we were preventing them from getting what they needed from the sea. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Right, so the B-29s flew dangerous missions, of course, and we're going to talk about how the engines were a part of the factor in losing a lot of B-29s, but the enemy was out there. In fact, some were even attacking us at the hump. But when we took the Marianas, the Japanese did have aircraft that could make it to the higher altitude the B-29s were at initially. Oscars and Tonys and high-performance Japanese aircraft could get up there. But the B-29s had that sophisticated gun system. So flak wasn't a threat to the bombers. You had the fighters, and the gun system on the fighters took out about 714 enemy aircraft, roughly a number 1,100 probably destroyed. There were around 11,000 attacks on B-29s throughout the war. One of the Japanese pilots, I believe it was Sakai, called them the tremendous bulls. And sometimes the only way that these fighters could take down B-29s was to resort to ramming them. They're called aerial kamikazes. So we had B-29s that were being damaged or taken out by the enemy. We also had B-29s that were being taken out by the unreliable engines, including roughly 2,000 airmen. I think I missed the statistic there. Were lost, were MIA because the B-29s had to fly over such a long stretch of ocean. And if a B-29 did go down, you'd have to hope that there was a submarine on that route, or they were in range of a patrol aircraft that could pick them up. Otherwise, they're lost forever. And there you have LeMay with injured airmen, and obviously praying didn't hurt either. Let's go to the next slide about the living conditions. Unlike the airmen in the European theater, the air crews that were flying the B-29s were in much more primitive conditions. Humidity, heat, monsoons affected these guys that were in tents or Quonset huts, I guess, whatever the CBs could get constructed for them. You had mud and heat, malaria, and even rogue Japanese soldiers that still might be on that island. So it wouldn't hurt to carry a sidearm with you if you had to go to the latrine at night. So not as comfortable as the European theater counterparts that they had. And this included not just the air crews, but the ground crews. And here are some ground crews who are taking part in arming a B-29, adding bombs to the B-29, fueling the B-29, checking the engines. So the ground crews played a critical part in keeping these massive aircraft flying, just as they did in other theaters of combat. And we've met a few and are touring, which is great. It's wonderful to meet some ground crews and the men who took care of these aircraft along course with the crews. Here you have an example of some bombs carried by B-29. Again, they could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs. So even our Fifi has some replica 500-pound bombs inside. Some of these bombs are considerably bigger than that. You can see a few examples here. So next slide. So we just did have the anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima. This battle was critical for the United States to get a foothold on this island, but it was also critical because our B-29s needed that island. Our B-29s were flying to Japan, and Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, it was an early warning system to the mainland. B-29s were coming to attack the mainland, and they could warn Japan. There also were enemy fighters on Iwo Jima that could go up and attack the B-29s. Some of them could even reach some of the bases in the Marianas. In the end, the cost of capturing that island allowed us to safely land 2,200 B-29s, and up to 24,000 airmen were saved because this island was taken and they could land safely. Next slide has a picture of an old friend of ours, Captain Jerry Yellen. Captain Yellen was part of the Bushmasters and the very long-range P-51s that were based on the island, as well as P-47s and Black Widows. These aircraft were based on Iwo Jima, and I remember Jerry Yellen telling me they landed and set up their base on their living conditions on the base, and the island wasn't even taken yet. So there was still combat going on when they were bringing in their P-51s. He flew 19 missions, and the B-29s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, had the navigation system to get to Japan, so the P-51s had to tag along, and they could either escort and protect the B-29s enemy fighters or go off and prowl around Japan and look for targets. And he was in the Bushmasters, and you can see he looked just as good in his uniform as he did as a young man. He just passed away a couple of years ago. So, all right. This is an interesting slide. It's a warning leaflet that was dropped by B-29s or before cities were going to be bombed on missions later. So we maybe had a little more air superiority at the time, and we were confident enough that we could warn the civilian population to evacuate before we bomb their cities. All right. So we come to the conclusion of the B-29 service in World War II with the to atomic missions. And you have the Hiroshima mission, August 6, 1945, with General Tibbets, who's, we can see later, has flown Fifi. And you can see what little boy was made of. And then we dropped another bomb, Fat Man, on August 9th, plutonium bomb. And I believe that's a picture of the bomb over Nagasaki. And so we just interviewed a man from my flyer who his uncle was on one of the photo recon ships that took pictures of the aftermath of the bombing. But that's what brought Japan finally to the table to surrender. Okay, next slide. So the B-29s weren't retired altogether because they, of course, had a huge fleet of B-29s, and the Korean War ensued, and they were used in the Korean War, but things had changed by then. It was a different kind of war. Next slide. For one thing, we had a sophisticated gun system on the B-29s, but they were now shooting at jet aircraft that were flying at such high rates of speed that the gun systems couldn't adapt and fire accurately at the MiGs attacking the B-29s. There also weren't really large targets for them to bomb. There weren't large cities, there weren't large industrial areas, so you had bridges and things, so it just seemed not to make sense to put these planes at risk to bomb targets like that. And frankly, jets at the time, like this F-84, were equipped and could carry nuclear weapons. So B-29s became tankers and transports and did recon in Korea for the most part. So Korean War ends, B-29s are no longer needed by the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command. So what happens to them? Many of them end in airplane graveyards. They're scrapped, target practice, or forgotten, except for the one that I was about to talk about.
All right, and the Enola Gay here that's in the museum. So the Enola Gay and Boxcar are both preserved in the museum. Enola Gay at the Air and Space Annex at Dulles, and Boxcar in Dayton at the U.S. Air Force Museum. Okay. All right, let's talk about Fifi. So she began because of an idea that germinated in Harlingen, Texas. Lloyd Nolan and his early group that comprised the makings of the CAF started out very humbly with a P-51 and then started to acquire other aircraft, B-17s and B-24 as well. Our Diamond Lil was acquired in '68. And then part of this process, it was rather audacious, but they thought, well, let's get a B-29. There were none to be found, but there were some out there that weren't called B-29s anymore. They were actually owned by the Navy and were sitting in China Lake in California to be used as target practice. But through perseverance and some pull and some political work, we finally had the ability to select one of these fuselages and make a purchase of it for to preserve this aircraft. So in China Lake, I think they looked at 7 or 8 aircraft and chose the one they thought that was in the best shape, and it was completely intact, but needed work. So as we'll see in the next slide, the instruments had all been removed from the aircraft, not through vandalism, but that was the norm when they decommissioned an airplane, to take anything of value out of it. So if you're getting ready to go, well, you've got to find all those instruments again. It was a big undertaking, and you had to replace everything that had deteriorated in the 15 years that it sat in the desert. So they made use of a crew that was good at this type of restoration, or this preparation to take an airplane out of those conditions. And after 9 weeks of frantic work, the CAF crew, Randy Sohn, Lefty Gardner, Roger Baker, and others, made a what I call a really audacious flight out of Central California all the way down to Harlingen, Texas. You know, I've flown Fifi quite a ways, but I don't think I've flown it that far, and I don't know that I want to. So, you know, after sitting in the desert for 15 years, that was a pretty gutsy move. So my hat's off to them. And after some additional restoration, it was looking pretty good. So who's responsible for making this happen? One of the premier people was Victor Agather. He had been involved in the Battle of Kansas and in other efforts during the war for B-29. And after the war, he did become involved in this. He spent money, political capital, worked with Barry Goldwater and others to get this aircraft going and out of the desert. And he very wisely named this after his wife, whose nickname was Fifi. And here's a great photo of them. And the CAF decided to provide recognition to Vic for his leadership and painted the big A on the tail. So that A is still there and the name Fifi is still there. We're very proud to have the recognition for those, that great couple. Let's go to the next here. There are many slides that we could have here of veterans and so forth involved in this. And in our other webinar, we do have some of those veterans, but we thought we would include this one. Certainly iconic that General Tibbets would be flying our B-29. And he did during the 70s. He flew it fairly often for air shows and so forth with CAF. And then again in 1998, we see another photograph of him flying the aircraft. So that's history for sure. So this aircraft toured on and off up until, from the early 70s all the way up to 2004, but they constantly struggled with the overheating engines. And even though they had a lot of engines, they just weren't reliable enough. Even a freshly overhauled engine would only last a few hours. So the design just needed to be improved. It was a challenge to, very difficult to make the decision, let's park this airplane, but they did. It was the right thing to do, and it took about 6 years before things could really happen and raise money and find a way to create a new and better engine design. So we'll see that who came to the rescue was Jim Cavanaugh, the Cavanaugh Flight Museum. He came to the rescue in the way of funds. Others were involved in the technical end of things, looking at the B-29 3350 engines and deciding how do we improve on it. Well, they simply tracked what had been happening since World War II. In Vietnam, the Sky Raiders were flying with that engine. The C-119s were flying with that engine. Why? Because it had been upgraded, the design had continued to evolve. So we basically brought together the best of those newer types of improvements on that engine to create a new and improved 3350 for the B-29. So 4 new engines, and in 2010, I believe it was, they took off on their first flight. I think Konley had something to do with this artwork. Design here for the Betty Grable, Rita Hayworth, Mitzi Gaynor, and Ingrid Bergman. Those are names that are on each engine cowl, and we're proud to have those on it. It's always a great point to make with those coming around to the aircraft. I'll let you cover it for a bit.
So we're just privileged and overjoyed that we can give Fifi just a beautiful home at the Command Air Force location now, Dallas Executive Airport, in the National Aviation Education Center, Henry B. Tippie building. So that's where Fifi is. There's more than enough room to put Fifi in there, or B-24 in there, and several other aircraft. It also has the world famous Nose Art collection, the Rise Above Theater, and some great education programs. I've heard about one called Bill Guild, which was interesting, of course, and then kids camps coming up. The CAF has these statistics. We've upgraded them, should be correct. I think Steve could help me if I've got any issues here, but you can see statistics on the CAF there. If you'd like to join us, there should be a unit near you. So check us out, get on caf.org and take a look. And I think Al's going to cover our tour now coming up.
So we have a couple of websites here I think that you'll find very interesting. CAF B29 B24.org is what's shown here in the center, and it has a lot of information on our squadron. Jeremy Ott, who's pictured on the bottom left, is now our office administrator who takes care of this. On the lower right is AirPower History Tour, and you can shorten that up in a URL. It's airpowertour.org. And that is where we have all of our ride information and our touring information. So we'll see on the next slide that we have this year, 2022, just about to launch a very extensive schedule. We did last year as well, but this year we're focusing on, as you can see, east of the Mississippi for the most part. We start out in just about 3 weeks at an air show in Louisville, Kentucky, because it's the 75th anniversary of the Air Force. So we'll start there and then head down through Georgia, down to Daytona Beach, come back up through Augusta, Georgia, up through Baltimore, up to Reading. That's always a great air show, World War II air show. Through Ohio and Cincinnati at Lunken Airport, Indiana, Chicago area. And then during AirVenture, we'll be up at Appleton, just north of Oshkosh, selling rides, doing rides there. And I'll have the pleasure of flying the aircraft from there over to Rochester, just squeaking across the Mississippi River a few miles, spend a week there, or at least a weekend. And then we're going to try something new. We're going to go north up to the upper Michigan area, which is the old Sawyer Air Force Base at Marquette, and then over to Alpena, Michigan, down to Saginaw, back into Ohio, Niagara Falls, and then out to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It's the Air Force Peace Air Force Base. And then we get to come down to the DC area again, a quick stop in Baltimore. Then Andrews Air Force Base is putting on an air show again, 75th anniversary of the Air Force. So we're pleased to be invited to that. Then we'll make our way home through Lexington, Evansville, Little Rock, get back in September. So these aircraft are on the road from the middle of April all the way through the middle of September. Fortunately, I'm not with them the whole time. Some are. So that's quite an endeavor. It was quite an endeavor just to plan this. So let me tell you, our planning committee. All right, continuing here, next slide. Con, you want to touch this?
Yeah, I think Al stressed something to Al, myself, a lot of volunteers, roughly 300 members make this happen in our squadron. We just had 2 ground schools for the B-29 and B-24. And ride flights are a critical part of our process. It's a chance for people to understand what their fathers or grandfathers went through. If we have veterans, of course, and they can fly on the plane, they will. But it's an amazing experience. It's that, that bucket list everyone talks about. This is a chance to fly on a B-29. And so you see our crew there, well trained, makes it a great experience. You can move about the plane once the airplane, the pilot clears you to do that. If you're in the back, you can go all the way to the tail gun. If you're in the front, of course, you can look through that amazing view. So you can come see the plane, you go through the gate, you can see the outside of the plane. We'll see cockpit tours in a second, but ride the plane if you can, because it's something to brag about, that's for sure. You'll be in an elite club of people who have flown on this amazing B-29. The next slide is the more volunteers and the people that really are kind of the heartbeat while we're on the road, keeping things going, and that's our ride desk team. So you can make arrangements on the website or on location to ride on our aircraft, and other aircraft join the tour as well. Of course, the B-24, B-29 are there. Steerman could be there. We have T-34, we have a T-6, and if we're near a unit that has a plane like a Mustang or something, they'll join up. So it's like flying circuits, and with the 29 and 24 as kind of the focus. So next slide is also, we have a PX crew, Rocky and Alma, couple that follows us on tour, and they have lots of wonderful merchandise on sale. And it's just nice. I know the crews love seeing Rocky and Alma and their beautiful tent all set up when they arrive. It's like home away from home, but it's a great example to go home with a keepsake, something to remind you of your experience seeing the plane and riding on the plane. One thing that's amazing, if you go to a museum to see aircraft, they don't usually let you walk into the cockpit, but at our shows you do. Can you imagine waiting in line to walk through the bomb bay, you climb through the bomb bay of Fifi, go into the cockpit and come out the nose, and you get to see the inside of a B-29. Very authentic, and had just been flying that morning. Most of the time we do cockpit tours after the last morning flight till the end of the day. You can see people waiting in line. Often they'll use that long wingspan as shade if it's really sunny. One other thing, okay, to show, there we go. The banner is something we created a couple years ago. Al and I worked on this. The B-24 also has one. It's a great way to present the history of the aircraft and let people read it at their leisure and let our crews really do what they might need to do to keep the plane operating that day or just to take a rest. So this is a nice way for us to share the information about B-29 history on the bomb bay door of the aircraft. And there are ways to support us. Of course, we'll talk about joining us, but we also have something called the Fifi Century Club. And this is a $29 sustaining member fee every month to support our squadron. You get a sustaining member pin and a patch that you can put on your uniform. This is our safety officer, Colonel Stu, modeling this for us. And then if you want to, there's a higher rate of $58 a month, and then even a higher rate of $1,500 a month, which is gold, and 5,000 platinum. And that can get your name put onto the rear bomb bay of Fifi for all eternity. So something to consider if you want to contribute to our squadron and be a part of our operation. Al, why don't you take us on a tour and fly Fifi for us for a bit.
All right, let's talk about this aircraft in particular. You jump ahead there. It's a big airplane, and it feels like a big airplane. My background in general aviation, but also flying airliners. This is a big Boeing, huge wingspan. You can see that this thing was delivered in July 31st, 1945, while the war was still underway. But she is well known for all of the activities after the war. In the diagram for that we'll show here, we can see that propellers are not only big but low to the ground. There's only about a foot clearance on the inboard props and only about 2 foot clearance on the outboard props. So operationally, it's a big deal to handle on the ground. The gear's 33 feet wide, so a 35-foot taxiway is a real challenge, so we try to avoid that. Big wingspan, and it's about 100 feet long as well. Next. So this is obviously from a World War II diagram, but it shows the crew positions here fairly clearly. You've got the 6 people in the cockpit, and then behind the wing is the gunner compartment, and then far in the tail is the tail gunner. This is a good depiction of how crowded it can be in the cockpit, even without the people in it, because of all of the equipment. These aircraft were designed for a mission. So it was always stuff one more thing in, one more system to try to complete a mission and to do what the aircraft was designed to do. And that cockpit was pressurized. That's why it was shaped in the way that it was. This is a view from our cockpit in Fifi. It's standing in the very aft portion, back where the gun turrets would be, facing forward, past the radio operator on the right, navigator on the left, looking straight forward, past the pilot positions to the bombardier. This is just a little further forward, and it shows where the crew hatch is, navigator's table to the left, engineer to the right, and you can see the pilot stations. And again, the gun side all the way, or the bomb side all the way forward. Navigator's table, he's got this map, some instruments, airspeed, altitude, and compass, and so on. So he's using that along with the sextant and a drift meter to try to plot how he's going to find the island he's going to go back to after the mission. So it's like every other crew member, they really had to know their job, really had to be expert at it. I have the honor of sitting in this seat, have had for a number of years, and it's a bit unusual in that the instrument panel is kind of sitting there in the middle of the cockpit with the windshields far ahead of you. In addition, for every glass window, you have 4 metal frames. So even though it looks like an easy way to look out, it's really a challenge to be able to see what you need to see. And straight ahead, you can see the bombardier's position. And now we're looking to the right for the co-pilot. And then in the center, probably better on the next slide, is the center console, where the red levers are emergency brakes. The 4 numbered buttons are for feathering the propellers. Just to the right of those 4 buttons is a small red cover, and that's for the landing gear switch. It's nothing more than a toggle switch. And just after that is the flap switch. Again, it's just a toggle that you move, electrical switch to actuate the motors for the gear and the flaps. Now we do have the newer avionics, which are required in today's airspace. Flight engineer is busy from dawn to dusk, and he's servicing the aircraft, fixing it, fueling it, and then in flight, he is handling all of the engines and other systems. So this is his instrument panel, and just below it, we call it a switch panel, where he's got the starters and generators and so forth. Another view of the switch panel. It's a little bit dated, but basically on the right, you've got the 4 mixtures, which go opposite of what the throttles go. It's got the generator switches, starters, propellers, battery switches, and so on. So it's got a lot going on there. Has to really be expert at this aircraft. One of the engineering challenges was, how do you keep a pressurized aircraft when you have a large unpressurized area or 2 or 3? And this is a wonderful design where they have a tube that runs over the top of the wing, over the top of the forward and aft bomb bay. So this allows the crew member to just crawl between those, the cockpit or the other compartment very easily. And it also serves to equalize the pressure between the two. We have one of our Rosie derivators here that has been very active with us in past years. And we can see from the cockpit looking down the tube. Also notice at the top, there's a small dome. And that's where the navigator could lean back with his sextant, take a shot of the sun or stars. That was his portal to the top, as well as an emergency exit in a ditching. This is standing in the forward bomb bay, looking up. Of course, you see the bombs on either side, but you also have the tube or the tunnel that you're looking at from the exterior. So it goes along both bomb bays and is a great device for crew action. This is a depiction of the gunner's compartment. A lot of equipment. So you can see at the very top is a bubble for the central fire control. And the side bubbles are a little harder to discern here, but that's where the other gunners sat. You had electrical equipment. We call it an analog computer. Was it really a computer? Well, in a way it was, because it did the calculations necessary to transfer what was in the gun sighting to the guns for accurate firing. So yes, the radar operator would be right behind that bulkhead if they were on board. You can see the upper gun turret as well. Then we can see on our aircraft, no equipment. So we have the seats back there for our passengers. This is in the back looking forward. And you can see the barber chair where the central fire control would sit, and he would have his head up into that bubble and can look 360 degrees around. If you ride with us in a ride flight, once we're airborne and you can move about, you can go sit up in that chair and look around. It's a fabulous view. And we also have the side views. Here's the blister on the left side, where again, you can sit and look, lean over and see out, up, down, and see the wings and the gear and the engine and so forth. And on the other side, it's also a blister, but this one we have depicted with the gun sight in it. So you get an idea of what that looks like. It's a very complex piece of gear, It's, to me, similar to the Norden bomb sight in that it has to make all these calculations and corrections in order to give you an accurate result. So it's a fabulous piece of equipment. Looking backward in this compartment, you can see the bulkhead is bowed out. And of course, that's because this was a pressurized compartment. The door is open. We can go through this opening. And then we'll see the aft compartment, which has the APU and gun turret equipment on the next slide. This is a drawing of it just to show the amount of gear that was back there. The APU is near the front of this. Right behind it is the ammo belt storage, and then a crawlway that goes back to a door for a pressurized area where the tail gun was. So we could go in there and be at his station. He also had a gun sight. Now, he's right there by his guns, yet they are remotely fired. So he's not in there handling those guns at all. He's sitting a bit above them. And this depicts both the 20 millimeter as well as the 50 caliber. Some had that. I'll tell you what, it's very strange to be standing back there on a ride flight, turn around and look forward to see the tail of the aircraft. But I mean, it's a fabulous thing. If you're riding in the back of this aircraft on a ride flight and you're physically able, you can crawl back there, look around. It's fantastic. So on our aircraft, we can see what this looks like with the APU and the fuel tank for it, and the electronics that go with it. And then the next slide shows a little bit further back, the crawlway going back to the tail gunner's position. Notice all the cables along the left and right side. Those are the flight controls. So when you go back there, keep your hands off of that, please. That's my job. All right. Here's a shot of, without the cowling on, one of our great 3350s, 18 cylinders, 2200 horsepower. It's a lot of engine, a lot of spark plugs, a lot of maintenance just to have everything in finely tuned. It's a very finely tuned engine. And then we go out and fly it for 6-7 months with very little work, just you know, paying attention to it, but no major work to be done on them. Fantastic engine. I have this diagram simply to show you the complexity involved in something like the fuel system. So in the wings, we can see all of these, what looks like boxes, and those are individual fuel bladders, self-sealing. In case you get shot through the wing, it will seal that fuel tank because it's a rubberized component, has different layers. Outboard engines have 7 fuel tanks. Inboard engines have 4. This one shows the bomb bay also having 2 fuel tanks in the front and 2 in the back, just to show you what could be carried. And of course, it was always a balance between how many bombs you're hauling and how much gas are you hauling. For the atomic missions, the atomic bomb would be in the forward bomb bay, and in the back would have been a fuel tank. Just a quick look here at the flight engineers panel at the electrical system. There are 7 generators here. The one on the far right that doesn't have a light, that's for the putt-putt or the APU in the back. The other 6 are all engine driven. It has 4 engines, but 6 generators. So the outboard engines each have 2 generators. Why so much? Well, you've got electric gear, electric flaps, electric gun turrets, and other things. All the ancillary systems are electric. The only thing that's hydraulic on this airplane are your brakes. So it takes a lot, and it's a complicated system that worked. Here's another engineering thing that impresses me, and that is the flap system. If I'm needing to extend the flaps, I just reach down to center console and flip a switch for X number of seconds, and the flaps go out. If they don't, for some reason, I simply reach over and use a switch right next to it. And instead of using the normal flap motor, which you can see annotated there is laying horizontally, it will use the vertical motor. Okay, so it's a great and easy backup. It works at a little different speed, and there's some other limits, but it's a very simple backup. If that doesn't work, I can have one of the scanners from the gunner compartment come forward, use the switch at the top to do the same type of thing. And if that doesn't work, they can remove that motor and install a hand crank and crank the flaps. And the most interesting thing to me is that you can take this motor off, and it's got a nice long electric cable on it, and you can go over and install it in the sidewall in the gearbox and use it to crank the gear down. So it's this one motor does all these different things. So somebody was thinking ahead. So just a depiction of the landing gear, which of course is complicated, and it has its own, the black motor on the right is the normal gear motor. If there's a problem, this other motor can be used in its place in a different location. Okay. So let's talk about flying this beautiful aircraft. How does it fly? It flies beautifully. It flies like a Boeing, provided you're up and running and at a fairly good speed, like 190 miles an hour or more. It's well balanced, it's very stable, and relatively quiet. We don't have a lot of soundproofing in it anymore, but it's just a nice airplane to fly. However, if you're at slower speeds, the controls are far less responsive, and there's a lot more technique involved in handling the aircraft at slower speeds. So here, another aspect of this is you have a lot of different crew members. I say a lot, you know, a dozen or so pilots and flight engineers, and then scanners. A crew of 6 flies this aircraft. And in order to do this safely and efficiently and with standardization, we use things like procedures, profiles, checklists, call outs, and we want this to be done very in a very standardized fashion. So this depicts how we do a takeoff, or at least it's a simplified form of it. And it talks about when does the rudder become effective and 100 miles per hour to start rotating. And we're taking off about a 125, which by the way is our minimum speed if you lose an engine. And then stepping on the brake, pedals to stop the wheels from spinning, flaps up, different climb power settings, and so on. We'll show in the next slide a little more detail of that. So when we have someone coming through either to refresh his memory because it's been a year since he flew the airplane, or a new pilot, he needs to be looking through these things and be very, very familiar. I'm certainly not going to read them for you. I simply want to make the case that it's a complicated process and it needs to be done right in order to have a good outcome, right? So this is what the crew is doing. You have a crew of 6 working together. Each has their own role, and what looks like a nice, simple, straightforward takeoff has a lot of people doing a lot of things. So on the next slide, this is about a 1.5-minute video. I'll just talk through it so that you have some idea of what's going on with it. So this was a day with actually a pretty good crosswind out of Janesville. You could see the flaps on the trailing edge of the wings are extended a bit. It's about 15 degrees. Right now, the challenge is to steer with the throttles because there's no nose wheel steering. Steering with the throttles, getting the power up, and then calling to the engineer, engineer's throttles, set max power. And then at 100, we're starting to rotate. Now we're about 125, positive rates. Means we're flying, tap the gear, brakes, call the gear up. And you'll see the gear starting to come up slowly. Notice the shadow indicates the airplane isn't climbing very much. Now watch the flaps also retract. Now we're over 150 miles an hour. So the flaps up call is made. And now we can go to climb 1. So it's a reduction in the climb power for noise and to give the a little better margins over the engines. Notice we're still very flat here because we're trying to accelerate to 190 miles an hour and call for climb 2 power setting. Then we'll end the video here. So during this time, the basic point I'm making is the pilot flying is working with the flight engineer in a rapid succession, and with the co-pilot or the pilot not flying. All these things are worked together like you know, a concert. Okay, everybody's got their job, everybody's got their call outs, everybody's watching for certain things, making certain call outs. In the back of the aircraft, the scanners are looking through those bubbles, making call outs if they see something that isn't quite right. Is the gear coming all the way up? Are the flaps coming up? You know, are the engines operating nicely, and so on. So a crew of 6, and on a beautiful day, and we got the aircraft off the ground. Guess what? Before we ever got in position to go, the flight engineer spent a half a day getting this airplane ready to go, fueling it, making sure every last minute thing is checked, an extensive pre-flight. The scanners and other crew members were handling other duties, perhaps briefing passengers, putting things away from aircraft tours, and so on. So a lot of work went into that. Okay, so now we're going to just step forward to the landing. And again, we have a profile. How do we do this landing? Well, you're coming across at a certain speed, certain power setting, and by laying it out in this way, it allows us to know whether we're on profile or are we too fast, too slow, too high, too low, and so on. It's a good way to measure what we're doing and make corrections as needed. All right, so we're going to be coming across crosswind at 180, 1,500 feet. And if we're more than 180, when we turn downwind, we'll bleed some speed off. We'll call gear down. As soon as the gear is down, we'll call flaps 15, and the scanners will have been watching the gear, make sure it came down. Our speed will bleed off a bit. We'll descend a bit so we don't get any lower than 160. In the next turn, flaps 25, landing checklist. In the next turn, 150 miles an hour. And then the pilot flying will be talking to the engineer, talking about engine settings, power settings, and that's the manifold 2.4, manifold 2.2, manifold 2.0. And he'll do that all the way down until we're ready to touch down, and the pilot will call ease them off. That means bring the power to idle, and that's our landing. So on the next slide, we'll see this same sequence, but in more detail. And again, this is laid out for people who are going to be flying this airplane and to know exactly what you're doing at what point, and so on. All right, another short video that talks about, or that just shows a nice, easy landing, but there's a lot going on. This again was a windy day coming into Janesville. Notice how much flaps out there. That's at least 35 degrees. I'm not sure if it's 45 or not. I can't see that clearly. Probably 35 due to the amount of wind. And here's the alignment with the runway. So a slight right bank to line up with the runway. Gears down, we're all ready to land. Notice these approach lights coming into view. The nose is fairly low, so it needs to be raised in the flare. Okay, we're closer. Here comes the shadow. Where's the runway? Where's the runway? Ah, there's the runway. Notice the nose is slightly to the right of the center, and then it'll be brought back to the left here on touchdown. So it's a good touchdown, and lower the nose and just track the center line. Then we're going to jump ahead in the video here in a few seconds, and we'll see that the outboard engines are shut down. So here they come. Notice how the right prop is stationary. The left prop, he's moving that. The flight engineer is using the starter to move that, so the blades are in an X form. And that is because we're going to have some low taxi lights to go over on the left side. You can't see them really well, but if you look under the left wing, you'll start to see the taxi lights. And if the prop was spinning, you might have an unpleasant experience. So that's just one of the operational aspects of this. Anyway, that's how you take off and land on B-29 Super Fortress. Con?
Now, who was hanging below the plane shooting at June?
That was Kurt Lewis's GoPro. That was fabulous. We got some great video on those flights.
All right. Well, it's a little bit late, may not have come in, but we just wanted to let you know we're always looking for members to join up and to work with us in any capacity. I do graphics, newsletters, special events and things. Al flies the plane at maintenance opportunities. There's so many ways you can contribute to this squadron and be a part of our story. So the two shots you see at the bottom, and go to our website. You can't see it here, but the website, there's a, there we go, it refreshed. So there's our website. You can join and renew right there. And these are two very recent shots of Fifi and Lil and some other aircraft. And it's like a half track in the beautiful new Tippy National Aviation Education Center hangar. So please join us, and you're welcome to go to our website, contact us if you have any questions. So the next slide is our last slide. If we have any time for questions, we can. We want to remind everybody again, there's a longer version of this on our YouTube channel, plus quite a few other videos, including Al's walk around of the B-29. So go check that out if you got time. And thank you for supporting us, and thanks for your attention. And Steve, thanks for inviting us.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that have come in through the presentation. I'm going to kind of group these together. As a couple that have to do with operations. You were talking, Al, you were talking about the flaps system. Is there anything that would prevent a split flap condition on the airplane?
There's not a detection system like there are in later aircraft, so not really. You know, the only thing we really have in the manual is if you start putting the flaps out and you start to get a roll, stop and perhaps try to come back, but it's not sophisticated like it would be on the airliner.
All right, so your safety mechanism is the scanners.
The scanners and how the aircraft is reacting.
Right. Is there any, are the props synchronized manually, or is there a system that does that for the engines?
It's mostly manual. We do have a sync tack, which you can use, you know, between left and right wing, and then visually. But if you're looking through the propeller arc, it's a skill, of course. It's a little bit of an art, but the flight engineers are very good at keeping them in sync.
Just roughly, what's the fuel and oil consumption per hour?
B-29 is 400 gallons per hour and a couple of gallons per engine per hour on oil, and they're both very expensive.
As are all airplanes.
Yeah.
How long does it take to work up to crewing? And I know this is probably asked as far as being a pilot, but also the other crew members that are on board as well. There's different avenues to get into the airplane and get on tour.
Right. So if you're looking at a scanner position, for example, which would be the easiest avenue to be part of the crew, you attend our ground school, okay? And so there you get the book knowledge. Of course, we're doing things online, download the manuals, read the manuals, study. And then at ground school, they will take you through all of the different stations on how you do different things on the aircraft. Then you will go through a number of training flights where you'll be back there with an instructor and learning, and then come out on tour with us. Whether you're completely checked out or not, you could be a trainee on tour who is again learning and then get signed off at some point. It's a formal process. We've refined this quite a bit over the years, and that's how it works. It works well. We love having new people. We can always use new people who can tour. For pilots and flight engineers, you have to have some credentials, of course, before you get started. And a lot of that's spelled out in our regulations. But also we look for people that have a varied background. If you're only flying a 737, that probably doesn't get our attention. But if you're doing that and flying some tailwheel aircraft or some other Warbird or just some varied experience and have been flying a lot, and particularly in the GA world and the general aviation world where you know your way around, because we would like to have you well-rounded and up to speed before you come, try to fly one of our aircraft. We'd love to have you. We always need people. Steerman, T6, B-24, B-29, we need good people.
What's the glide slope angle for your approach?
Well, it's the normal 3 degree is pretty much what you're flying. We don't often have the nav aids available to us. We're just aiming at the numbers plus, plus 500 feet kind of thing, which after flying airliners for a while, this seems weird, but it really is what works. And so you're not off much from what you would do on a normal approach. If you're at a towered airport, you have to fly the VASI anyway to go legally. Smaller airports, you don't have them. You're aiming a little bit differently, but it's a fairly conventional glide path.
All right. We had the slides earlier of General Tibbetts flying in Fifi. Do you know, did General Doolittle fly B-29s at all during the war or later?
I don't know that he flew them. He was about to command a bunch of B-24s. I believe he's in Okinawa, and it was just at the forefront of, okay, Doolittle, here are your B-29s, go for it. He would have been the first commander outside of LeMay to take control, but then that never happened. So as far as I know, he never did.
Earlier on, you were talking about the dead man switch with the gunning, with the central fire control. The B-29 crews, like most other multi-member crews, were cross-trained. So if something did happen to one of the gunners, for instance, the other ones could take over. That was similar training for the B-29?
It was, but you didn't have to get up and go to his position to take his gun. So for example, while you're flying along, the bombardier was in charge of the upper and lower forward turrets. That was his default position. And as he got closer to the target and got busy with his bomb sight, the central fire control took over that as a default. In a similar way, if one of the guys, say the left gunner got hit, who automatically took over his? It depended on circumstance, but the next guy in line would automatically have control of his turret. So it didn't take anything special to be done in the heat of the battle, which is a big advantage.
Yes. With the tour that you're doing extensive on the East Coast and Upper Midwest, will there be any opportunities for Fifi and Doc to fly together this year?
I don't think we're scheduled to be anywhere together at the same time anyway. I think they'll be at Oshkosh, we'll be at Appleton. But I don't believe we have anything that's scheduled this year together.
And have you had an opportunity to fly, Doc?
I have not. I was scheduled to fly it at one point about 3 years ago, and there was a lot of changes going back and forth about who's available, who's not available. Somebody got sick, and I ended up flying Fifi that day, so I didn't. I never have. I've been in it a few times, but I've not flown.
Okay. And because there was another question here, what's it like? What the differences between flying Fifi and flying Doc?
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with that. Doc is a lighter aircraft, and it's slipperier in that it doesn't have gun turrets. So, coming down final on Fifi, you're carrying power, and if you're not watching, it'll bleed off speed really quickly. And Doc is a little bit the other way around, where less power and it's a little harder to slow it down. I think those are the fundamental things. It's a B-29 and ours is a B-29A, so there are some other differences, but it doesn't necessarily make it fly different. The other fundamentals are pretty much the same. And I think the procedures are pretty close to what we do.
Yeah. Well, good. That takes care of all the questions that we had from the audience tonight. Any final thoughts from either of you before we wrap up?
Come join us. airpowertour.org shows you where we're going to be and book seats.
Make a model of Fifi.
Yeah. Thanks very much for hosting us. Appreciate those that joined us, and always available to answer questions.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us again tonight. And don't forget to click the like, subscribe, or follow button so we can let you know about our upcoming shows. And as always, if you have an idea for a topic, an airplane you'd like us to cover, or someone you'd like to hear more about, we'd love to hear about it. Just send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to Al Benzing and Konley Kelley for their presentation this evening. And until next time, for the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.